deaf and cochlear implants. And the study that I read is called Deaf Culture, Cochlear Implants, and Elective Disability. So deaf culture, deaf with a lowercase d indicates a person that has tried to assimilate themselves into regular or normal society, has found ways of reading, lip reading, or using hearing aids to improve their hearing. But deaf with an uppercase D means that they identify their deafness as their culture, much as somebody would identify themselves in the U.S. as Hispanic or Black. They perceive their deafness as a characteristic that should be cherished instead of improved on by using hearing aids or getting the cochlear implant. Deaf culturists consider themselves a culture not only because American Sign Language is grammatically different than English, but because they have their own like segregated schools, deaf-only schools, or other deaf-only environments that create this culture and this feeling of a bond, like a togetherness. Deaf culturists have even gone so far as to seek geneticists to determine whether or not their child will be born deaf, for the purpose of creating a deaf child. Much of the study that I read elaborates on how illogical it is to keep your child deaf with the medical availabilities that there are now, or the medical technology to improve hearing, just because they want them to grow up as they did, to be in the deaf culture. So the author of this particular study is deaf, and she thinks it was illogical for these parents to want their children to be deaf. So the cochlear implant has 4 parts: the microphone, the speech processor, and the transmitter or stimulator, and electrodes. So there's a magnet that's surgically placed behind your ear, and electrodes that are surgically implanted that lead to the cochlea. So the outside part of the device can be taken off, but the magnet and the electrodes stay inside of the inner ear, in the ear. So on this slide there are 2 quotes that I thought were really important from the study. The first one is actually from the Advisory Council of the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders that the author of this study quoted. It says, "It has now been demonstrated that the long-term benefits of cochlear implants in children are not limited to speech recognition, but extend into dramatically improved language learning and language skills." So it's just reinforcing the ability that a cochlear implant has in helping a deaf person. The next quote is from the author of the study that I read, and it says, "However, experience has proven that early implantation is necessary for maximum efficacy of a cochlear implant." So she's trying to illustrate that the earlier a deaf person receives the surgery to get the cochlear implant, the more effective the cochlear implant will be on their language and speech skills. So deaf culture and cochlear implants. By deaf culturists' decision to keep their child from getting a cochlear implant to try and further the deaf culture, they are effectively taking away the future for a child to gain the maximum benefits of the cochlear implants and becoming a self-sufficient member of society. The whole argument that was written about in the study that I read was about how the deaf culturists advocated that they wanted their children to be able to decide for themselves if they wanted to get a cochlear implant or not, because it's such a big surgery, it's such an invasive surgery, like something put into your body, that they wanted their child, if they were born deaf, to make the decision for themselves. But by the time the child is cognitively able to make the decision, they're like between 12 and older, and it minimizes the effects that the cochlear implant actually has. It would be better for the child if they received it when they were younger. So by a deaf culturist not giving that surgery to their child right away, they are making the decision for their child to not receive the benefits of getting a cochlear implant. Also, to go back to the cochlear implant, the author is speaking about people that have the financial availability to receive a cochlear implant, and when a cochlear implant is like approved for the child, because in some situations it's not surgically available for the child to receive. And the author makes a point to note that it's not to say that they should be discriminated against if they have tried to improve their hearing, which actually has more to do with the next slide. Elective disability. Elective disability, an individual who chooses not to correct his or her deafness or their children lack the moral right to demand that others pay for costly accommodations to compensate for the lack of hearing of that individual or child. In this age of budget crisis and cries for tax reform, when there is talk of and some action with respect to different sorts of financial cuts, it is unrealistic at best to expect society to fund expenditures that could be eliminated. And that is a direct quote from the Hastings Center report that I read. And it's basically saying that the deaf culturists really they support the American Disabilities Act that provides financial assistance to disabled persons, but they are not trying to reduce the financial burden on the other people in society, the taxpayers in society that pay for the American Disabilities Act and the financial aid that they award persons. So the author thinks that it's not a good thing that the deaf culturists are doing by not trying to improve their hearing to lessen the burden. So then, working with deaf students. On average, a deaf person reads at a 4th grade level. One third of deaf students drop out of high school, and 1/5 of deaf students leave college without a degree. So it's important to know the different types of hearing loss. Here I have listed 2, but there are other types of hearing loss, and there are also sometimes mixtures, or like a couple reasons why someone has hearing loss. So conductive, they might have some hearing, they might use speech, they might benefit from hearing aids. Sensory neural affects the inner ear and nerves. They have limited hearing and speech recognition. They're likely to use sign language, and they might qualify for a cochlear implant. Another thing about sensory neural hearing loss is they might have balance problems, which is especially important to know for physical education class to make modifications if they're needed with that type of hearing loss. So teaching, reflecting on your teaching style and your Classroom management is always a positive thing to do to improve yourself, but recognizing and reflecting on disabled students' abilities is important to help them learn. So recognizing and reflecting on what causes students if they have behavioral or affective characteristics. So does the student feel isolated? Do they feel socially deprived or ridiculed? Is the child frustrated about something hearing sensitive in your class? Which is causing them to act out in certain ways, or in other cases withdraw? Incidental learning is indirect, unplanned, or additional learning. So this can happen socially, through conversation, or through games, anything that's not directly a learning environment. So with a deaf person, if the student is not able to understand or hear what other students are saying as side conversations, then they're not able to gain the same amount of knowledge that the other students in that class can, who can hear. And then also in a deaf segregated school or deaf only school, not participating with hearing students make them not exposed to the diversity that a hearing student would bring to the class. And they won't be gaining the same amount of knowledge as other students, so it's important to try to include them in all aspects of the class. Helpful options: starting a peer tutoring program, for instance a Best Buddies type scenario for physical education class, teaching the students' peers sign language, even such short signs as go, stop, yes, no, come here, throw the ball, would be beneficial to being able to communicate, for helping the student to communicate in class. And then offering leadership opportunities is important to helping the student learn, and giving them the tools they need to be the leader is very important, because if they don't have the tools they need to succeed, they could develop feelings of frustration or resentment towards the role of being a leader or the teacher, if they're not being able to accomplish that. And then generally we know that success in physical education is important to continuation of PE classes. So that's another reason. And then things to consider with a cochlear implant: avoid contact sports, obviously, because it could damage the piece that they're wearing. It should be removed when sweating. It should be removed during water activities. It's caution during the winter activities when it's cold out, and avoiding static electricity, which most plastic equipment used can create static electricity in the classroom. Inclusion of the child: learn sign language, learn some sign language, teach sign language to their peers, promote leadership to help them feel included in the class. Definitely research or find out which type of hearing loss it is, to help be able to modify the activity if needed, or any other sort of learning help that they might need to receive. Find out their hearing level, so find out how loud you need to speak, or if you need subtitles, and then check for understanding. There's this thing known as the deaf nod, where you could be telling a deaf student instructions, and they might be nodding their head and smiling and looking directly in your eye, but really they have no idea what you're talking about. This is also found when two deaf persons are talking. This sometimes happens because American Sign Language is much like the English language with slang and different words being used for the same thing. So sometimes they'll be nodding but really have no idea what you're saying. So a solution to this is definitely ask comprehensive questions instead of just "do you understand," where they can just nod. Use their body and physical cues to check for their understanding or their learning, and just use follow-up questions. And then my last point on inclusion is understanding the role of the interpreter. Make sure to speak directly to the child and not the interpreter, because an interpreter will not be answering the questions. The child will, and also it'll help them feel like they're more of the center, that you're speaking to them and they're not a second person to the interpreter. Teaching techniques. Use visual formats, chalkboards, overheads, handouts. Talk clearly. Don't be walking around the gym or walking around the field so that they can't see you, or there's a difference in the loudness of your voice. Don't have your back to the sun so they can't see your face. This is known as silhouetting. And if the sun's behind you, they can't see your face. It's just black. It's a darkened shadow. It's in the shadow, so they can't read your facial clues, and they can't lip read if they can lip read, or see any of your emotions when you're speaking. Turn music, air conditioning, fans, any type of background noise off to let them be betterly able to hear you. Demonstrate visually whenever possible. This is good not only if a student is deaf, but for students that have different types of learning or need that visual demonstration to be able to connect with whatever activity you're doing. Then provide instruction for substitute teachers, obviously, so that they understand the disabled student that's in your class and they understand what's going on in class. And then my last point is repeat questions and comments by other students to clarify. If you're having a discussion and there are students in the group talking, the deaf student or hard of hearing student may not be able to hear what the other students are saying because they can't directly see their face or see their lips, or their voice is just lost in the projection of the room, or whichever it is. It's always helpful to repeat comments or questions by the students to help the deaf or hard of hearing student be able to understand and learn and receive the information that everyone else in the classroom is receiving at that time. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the handout.